Okay, thank you, Gary, for joining me today. So we're reading your chapter in Sick of the System, and we have basically just three questions to help maybe clarify your argument. So the first question is simply, why did you write the chapter? What was the drive behind that chapter?
Yeah, the drive for writing the chapter was that actually in March, I was reflecting on the pandemic as it was developing and was seeing that there were very little connections being made between earlier organizing around AIDS and what
Yes.
was going on with COVID-19. And I saw a lot of connections. I'd been an AIDS activist involved in a whole series of groups, both community-based AIDS groups like the AIDS Committee of Toronto and more activist groups like AIDS Action Now.
Yes.
Um, and I saw a lot of connections there that weren't usually being made, or else they were being made in very superficial ways.
Hmm.
And what I wanted was to actually bring into the discussion about how to respond to the pandemic some of what we learned, some of the acquisitions of AIDS activism. So I wrote a piece that was initially on my website, Radical Noise. And then later on, I was approached by Amanda from Between the Lines about participating in this ebook, which I thought was a great, fabulous idea.
Thank you.
And what I did was I revised and updated the piece. So it's a little bit more updated than in March. I mean, one of the most interesting things about the pandemic has been how fast things move and how fast things change.
Yes.
So I did update it, and I actually made some of the arguments a bit sharper. I had to drop certain arguments for space reasons. So the global dimension of dealing with the pandemic and the need to transfer resources to the global south to fight it, unfortunately, got cut out. I hope that comes up somewhere else in the book. So that's basically why I did it.
Yeah.
And I was very pleased to do it. I was very glad that Between the Lines decided to do this ebook.
Thank you. And so what is the main takeaway? So if I'm reading that chapter, what was it that you wanted readers to get from it? What was the main issue?
If there was a single main takeaway, it would be that what people often just accept as being good and in everyone's interest, the notion of public health actually needs to be scrutinized much more critically. So coming out of my experiences as an AIDS activist, I really strongly feel that we always need to ask which public and whose health is being defended.
Yes.
In the context of the AIDS crisis, it was clear, especially initially, that gay men, Haitians and other people of color, injection drug users, sex workers were being defined as the high-risk groups. And the public that was being defended by public health was actually coded as being white, middle class, and heterosexual. So that led to certain groups of people being defined as almost being expendable in the context of the AIDS crisis. I think there's some similar processes at work in the context of the pandemic. And I'll just maybe give a couple of examples.
Please.
One of the main public health arguments has been stay at home, right? That we've heard from government officials and public health officials. And there's some real problems with this. It constructs home and the private realm as somehow being safe when we know for many women in our society, it's a site of violence and abuse. We know that for many queer and trans young people, it's a site of violence and abuse that many of them actually get expelled from. And we also know that there's lots of people who don't have homes, right? So that homeless people can't possibly go and stay at home, right? So there's a whole series of class-based judgments and judgments about how the so-called private realm is supposed to be safer than the public realm. One of the things I think that's really crucial right now is to realize that one of our responses should not have simply been to tell people to, quote, stay at home, but to also provide spaces for people in a more public realm, like closing down streets or using large parks to allow people to safely physically distance. I mean, another whole position that was put forward in public health at the beginning was we need to socially distance, right? Now, I only will use the word physically distance because I think we actually need the social far more now than we ever have. And we actually need to reconstruct what the social is to build bonds of solidarity and compassion and care in the context of this pandemic if we're going to survive it. What this also led to was certain types of notions of the people who are most susceptible to COVID-19. Obviously, that includes older people, people with compromised immune systems, people with disabilities, almost de facto being defined as being expendable. so that we've seen the horror stories of what's happened in
Sure.
long-term care facilities in Canada. Rather than taking care and respecting the wisdom of older people, like Indigenous cultures do, we basically have left them in death camps, right? I mean,
So
there's lots of reasons for that.
yeah.
We can go into it in more detail. The other aspects of it that we can see are that there's also been the mobilization of certain arguments. Herd immunity was one that we heard early on from the UK government. And basically it was that you don't actually do anything to protect people and people will develop an immunity. Well, obviously that means the people most susceptible to COVID-19 are going to die. And of course, now it's clear that this notion of herd immunity would never have worked in this situation anyway. But what it would mean is that lots of people were going to die in the development of this herd immunity. And more recently, the mobilization of restart the economy is being used to actually put lots of people, especially precarious and low-wage workers, at risk of infection. So those are some of the main takeaways. So I would really want people to think more critically about notions of public health, because it operates in some people's interests and not in the interests of other people. And oftentimes, like in the AIDS crisis, can actually get in the way of the types of solutions that are necessary for people to survive, either AIDS or the current pandemic we're facing.
So I guess obviously this is a much longer conversation, but it really does beg the question. Then it brings up this question: why should the system be interested in disregarding the vulnerable? Why is the system not interested in, quote unquote, the non-productive? Why is the system creating, if you will, categories of your word, expendables, right? People who are expendable. What is there a way to address that?
Well, I mean, obviously it has to do with the logic of a capitalist, racist, patriarchal type of society in which we live. Whatever gains our movements have won, it still has that fundamental character, so that if you're not seen as being productive in the context of productivity for capitalism,
Yes.
for big business, then you're seen as being more expendable. So older people are not as valued as people who could be, quote, more productive. And these are fundamental problems that are built into a capitalist, racist, patriarchal society, that Indigenous people and Black people don't have the same type of access to healthcare and the same types of social supports that other people do. Also makes them as groups more vulnerable, especially in the States, but also here, to COVID-19 infection. And we've also seen how migrant workers, given the conditions of exploitation in which they live, are actually made quite susceptible to the spread of COVID-19. So what we actually see is it's the character of the society in which we live, the fundamental social relations that define it, that actually produce these problems. I've said this before about the AIDS crisis. The AIDS crisis was a condensation of many different social relations, all of which needed to be addressed. COVID-19 is also that, again, on a global scale. It has different features from the AIDS crisis, but it's a condensation of social relations. And unless we actually deal with its capitalist, racist, and patriarchal character, we're going to have some significant problems. They're planning to impose on us major austerity regimes to try to pay for, in their terms, the expenditures that they've made. They don't see that, like, allowing people to survive and creating conditions for care and social reproduction to take place is actually important. Instead, they're going to try to impose on us a massive austerity agenda, which we have to totally oppose. And that's one of the reasons why I think this book is so useful, because it actually poses in a number of different ways, looking at it from different vantage points, why we can't simply return to the normality of capitalist, racist, patriarchal relations. We actually have to use what we've learned from surviving this pandemic to actually radically transform the society that we're in, to put care for people and social reproductive labor at the center, and not private profit, not the needs of corporations and capitalist states.
That's great. Thank you, Gary. That's very clarifying, and really helps expand, I think, some of the notions that are mentioned and that are dealt with in the text. So the last question is simply then, was there something that you would change now that you've had, some time to think about it? A lot has changed in the last 5 months or the last 4 months. Is there anything that comes to mind that you
I
would
would, I
change
would,
or?
I would actually want to update it a lot. I, in some ways, almost totally rewrite it because
Okay.
the world, the
Yeah.
world has changed so significantly, even from putting this together. I
Sure.
guess it would have been late April, early May,
Yeah.
that I was writing the version that's published in the ebook. Um, the world has changed so dramatically. So, for instance, especially what I say at the end around the forms of resistance and forms of protest,
Yes.
clearly the global uprising starting in the United States against anti-Black racism
Mm-hmm.
and police violence and murder
Mm-hmm.
has shown that, you know, mass resistance is possible in the context
Yes.
of this of the pandemic itself,
Mm-hmm.
and that direct action protests are also quite possible, which I was very skeptical about when I was thinking this through, both in when I was writing the original draft in March and then revising it in late
Mm-hmm.
April, maybe early May. So the world has changed quite significantly. So I would actually want to change that part especially, and add in how there are many different forms of resistance. I've been actively involved in
Mm-hmm.
solidarity with Black Lives Matter in Toronto and organizing
Yes.
protests there, including a 3,000 person abolish the police rally on Pride Day, which was for me the best Pride Day I'd been at
Yeah.
since
Yes.
2016 when Black Lives Matter supposedly disrupted, but I would describe it as beautified the
Yes.
Toronto Pride Parade with their demands and their energy.
Of course.
So I would really want to change that. I also think one of the questions I would want to work with if I was revising the chapter now is how to bring that type of global uprising
Mm-hmm.
together with some of the needed responses to the pandemic. I mean, on the demonstrations coming out of the global uprising, people have been really conscious as much as they can about physical distancing and
Mm-hmm.
trying to organize them as safely as possible, you know, using megaphones and then wiping them off, um, disinfecting them before the next person uses them. So it's actually
Yes.
been quite incredible to see how
Yeah.
people have been taking such care in these protests, even when people are really angry and militant and you'd think might not be thinking about other things. But there's a real social
Mm-hmm.
consciousness, a real sense of social solidarity, social responsibility that I think we need to actually get to inform more of the response to the pandemic. Like, for instance, we need to
Mm-hmm.
actually be telling the public health officials and governments that
Mm-hmm.
no, they should not be, quote, reopening the economy right now.
Yeah.
Because what
Yeah.
we're seeing all over the place is as that happens, new outbreaks of infection,
Of
right? So
course.
clearly, if we put people's needs and lives at the center of
Yes.
our social response, we
Yes.
need to actually organize a movement to tell them to stop that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's ways in which some of the insights of the global uprising against anti-Black racism and the police can actually be quite helpful in informing the types of politics and organizing that we need now to survive the pandemic, and that we will definitely need once they try to impose austerity on us after the pandemic is in some ways over. Who
Mm-hmm.
knows what that's going to look like?
Do you feel then the events of the last few months are different then? Because you also mentioned you love the Pride from 2016, the Black Lives Matter, which was the eruption from the protest in Ferguson and the shooting of Mike Brown. I mean, that has similarities with, you know, the killing or the murder of George Floyd. But do you see it? I guess what I'm trying to say is we saw also mass protests because of that police killing, and which was quite international. We're seeing something similar now, but how do you see the similarities or differences? Because I think
Well,
you're trying to say there's something different right
I
now.
mean, I think that there's lots of similarities, right? And I think that a lot of Black activists and other anti-racist activists have learned a lot from those experiences
Hmm.
earlier on in this decade, right?
Hmm.
Or in the decade that we've just left. But I think the difference is that this is occurring in the context of a pandemic,
Yes.
right? So, and that's a very different context. And what we've actually saw, you know, in Minneapolis was that a mass
Hmm.
uprising, an almost insurrectionary uprising, was
Yes.
able to be organized in the context of a pandemic. I also think that for a whole bunch of different reasons, the resonance, globally speaking,
Hmm.
of this uprising has actually been deeper. And it's actually,
Hmm.
it's not simply just a challenge to anti-Black racism and to police violence and murder. It's actually, I think, an uprising against racist capitalism itself in some major ways. And that's one of the reasons why you've seen so many people trying to repress it, first of all, which of course is still going on, but also sort of contain it in a sort of liberal fashion. So to talk about it, oh, all you need is like a small defunding of the police and
Oh, I
everything will
see.
be fine, right? So there's
Yeah.
a real attempt to try to contain the hope for radical transformation and radical possibilities that have grown up out of this uprising. And I think that that resonates also with what one of the themes of the ebook was all about, was trying to talk about how we can't settle for going back to capitalist, racist normality after this is all over. We actually have to use this opportunity to push forward all of our struggles for major social transformation, so that after this is over, and it, you know, it will take different forms in different places,
Yeah.
that we actually can build a society based much more on caring, social justice, and the ending of capitalism and oppression and patriarchal relations, right? So
Yes.
that's a big, tall order.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I think what we've seen is
I'm
incredible
laughing. I'm laughing, Gary, because
possibilities that come out of that.
I'm laughing simply because we are, and I was just talking to friends saying, you know, so many of us are on universal basic income right now, right? So in a way, the future has already arrived, right? In this weird way.
Right. I mean, I would raise some critiques about universal basic income, because I think it's still based on notions of having a privatized market relations,
Sure,
and that
sure.
people are given money to then purchase various things. So I think another type of solution is necessary, but I understand entirely where you're coming from, that people are getting money from state agencies that, and there's been a certain validation of so-called frontline workers that actually shows that certain types of labor, which have never been valued before, are being valued now. And we have to ensure that that valuation of that labor continues, even if it's just the daily reproductive caring labor that we all have to engage in wherever we're located.
Well, thank you, Gary. There's so much more to say, but we're trying to keep it short. And thank you so much for doing this. It really, really helps. And in these uncertain times, please stay safe and healthy. And
I hope you can as well. And take care. And I hope the class goes really well.
thank you so much. Okay.
Okay. Take care.
All right.
Thanks.